Mikhail Chigorin, the strongest Russian player of his day, got off to an incredible start in his 1892 World Chess Championship rematch against Wilhelm Steinitz. He won Game 1 in crushing fashion with the Evans Gambit. Who would not love to see an Evans Gambit on the World Chess Championship stage today?
The Evans Gambit is not a bad opening at all. It's probably the best early gambit that White has in the e4, e5 lines.
And at one point, he had a 2-game lead in this match. However, Steinitz managed to equalize multiple times, and in Game 23, Steinitz had the lead. It said that Chigorin suffered from the Havana heat and was really struggling down the stretch. With Steinitz with the 1-game lead, Chigorin had a winning position and could have tied the match with 1 game to go when he blundered incredibly, allowing checkmate in probably the biggest blunder ever to happen in a World Chess Championship match. However, for today, let's set that blunder aside and focus on Game 1 and Chigorin's high point. As always, the Evans Gambit opens with pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and pawn to b4. Thank you to Captain William Evans for introducing this gambit all those years ago. Now, I'm an Evans Gambit player myself. I love playing this move. I do recognize that there are good theoretical options for black. For example, check out Fabiano Caruana's brilliant defense against Grandmaster Nisipianu, but on a practical level, there are a lot of challenges for white to meet and no really simple conclusion that refutes white's play. After pawn to b4, Steinitz does accept. Steinitz is no coward, as he proved over and over by successfully and often unsuccessfully, as in this game, trying to defend really, really bad positions against attacking players. Now, here after bishop takes b4, we see pawn to c3. Of course, white's idea in the Evans Gambit is that we're gaining time attacking this bishop on b4. We have rapid development, which the sacrifice of the b-pawn has allowed in some particular cases, and we are going to be quicker to castle than the opponent. These are all difficult challenges for black to meet, and white has kind of enough compensation. Here we get bishop to a5, which is theoretically kind of the best move, although bishop e7 is totally playable as well, as are other defensive moves, honestly, and castles from Chigorin. I like to play pawn d4, which is a little more popular and probably a little better, but castles is okay as well. Now, Steinitz in this position improves on his previous play, which is easy because his previous play in the Evans Gambit had been queen to f6, which is not a good move. The queen does not need to be developed to f6. This does not help develop the minor pieces, help get castled, and it does not help black meet the expansion in the center of the board with pawn to d4. And Steinitz did suffer when he played queen to f6. However, he also doesn't play maybe the best move in the position, which is Paul Morphy's knight to f6, the most active response. When your opponent plays a gambit, try not to play passively and safely. Try to play actively. Just because they've sacrificed a pawn doesn't mean they get to put their pieces on good squares and your pieces have to go to bad squares. Try to bring your knight to f6. Make them refute it. And in many cases, as in this case, there is no refutation. Steinitz's move, though, is a bit between the two. Pawn to d6. Not as bad as queen to f6, but not as active as knight to f6. Theoretically, okay. So here we get pawn to d4, expanding. We have a nice center here, but bishop g4. A good response from Steinitz, who has a pin here and is creating pressure against d4 by pinning the knight on f3 that is trying to provide security to the center. Bishop to b5, meeting the pressure on d4 by creating a counterpin on one of the pieces that is attacking d4. Pawn takes d4. I don't like this move. It's not really a mistake yet, but unless you have a clear intention to follow up with something direct, I don't recommend capturing on d4 because you're allowing white to have the strong pawn center without having any bulwark yourself on e5 as black. And also, the exchange of the e pawn for the c pawn means that white doesn't have a target on c3, and in some cases is going to be able to develop more rapidly. So my recommendation, don't trade on d4 until you have a clear follow-up. Try to hold on to the pawn on d5 as long as you can. At this point, Steinitz should really just play knight to e7, develop the knight. You don't have to worry about pawn d5 piling up on the pin knight, because you can always break the pin with pawn a6 and pawn b5, and black will get a good position. So Steinitz, though, does seem to be worried about the pin right here and the idea of pawn d5, because he plays bishop d7, a very passive move. He's pulling his bishop back, giving up on the beautiful pin on the knight on f3 that he had, and allowing Chigorin, just more time to develop his pieces and to try to develop a development advantage. So after bishop d7, we see bishop b2. Maybe not the best, but a good solid move. Knight out back to e7. You're expecting knight out to e7, but the knight pulls back. Again, a really passive move from Steinitz, and now he's definitely worse when he had no reason to be. Bishop takes on d7, queen takes on d7, and a great move from Chigorin, knight to a3. You might wonder, why would I want to put the knight on the edge of the board? I have heard that knights on the rim are dim, which is often true, but when you're thinking about developing knights, don't think about where they are, think about where they're going. A knight on c3 is actually not that useful for white. Where is it going? Nowhere that clearly effective. But a knight on a3 is headed to c4, which will be a great square for the knight, where it will support pawn to e5, it will attack the bishop right here, and if the bishop pulls back, it can often trade itself advantageously. So great move, knight to a3. Now, in this position, I would recommend active development, but Steinitz plays knight to h6 instead. Even though he's very courageous in accepting gambits, he's very passive in defending against them, avoiding every shot like pawn to e5. Knight c4, attacking the loose bishop, bishop back to b6, pawn to a4 with an idea of trapping the bishop. And of course, black kind of would like to play pawn to a5 or pawn to a6 to create some escape squares for the bishop, but you can't do that without allowing knight takes b6, which will wreck the black pawn structure. So in this position, Steinitz plays pawn to c6, which allows a very effective pawn to e5, gaining the d6 square and really trying to open things up while Steinitz has not yet castled, which it's move 15. World champions are highly advised, like other players, to castle before move 15. After e5 here, Steinitz really has one continuation that is viable, and he should have gone for it, and it's honestly quite surprising that he didn't. It's pawn takes on e5. Now, Chigorin might here play very creatively. There's bishop a3 and knight takes e5, both of which create good attacking chances for white, continuing to play in the style of being willing to abandon material for good open lines and dangerous threats. But the computer recommendation is pawn takes e5 here. And this allows a queen trade for Steinitz. Queen takes d1, rook a takes d1. Steinitz is still up a pawn here, but he's also not castled. He's got to deal with the idea of knight d6 check and a rook invasion on the d file. He can do that by castling, but he won't be able to hold on to the extra pawn without allowing Chigorin to overrun him. So he probably should give back the pawn, for example, in the computer line bishop a3, pawn c5. The rook invades, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn, knight to c6, and rook takes b7. Now, in this position, Chigorin is clearly better, but I earlier mentioned that Steinitz loved defending crappy positions. And this is a crappy position, but it's not a lost crappy position. It's the kind of position that Steinitz could definitely have held, and at least in some cases. He had chances to hold it. He made a career out of holding crappy positions like this, and it was the absolute best option available to him. Instead, after pawn e5, he played pawn d5, and Chigorin does not give him any more chances to hold the game here. Pawn d5 allows knight d6 check, and this is a monstrous knight. And also you have to move the king and give up the right to castle. And in this position, Steinitz is still up a pawn, and that is where his advantages end. Every white piece in this position is better than their black counterpart. That is not something you want to have happen to you. Also, white has lots of space and many concrete threats. There is objectively no way to hold this position, and Chigorin just smashes home his advantage. He starts with bishop a3, repositioning his bishop to an excellent diagonal where it is lined up with the knight on e7 and the king on f8. King over to g8 because that pressure made Steinitz so uncomfortable. Rook to b1 with an idea of pawn to a5, and then rook takes b7. And knight h to f5, a very natural move, bringing the knight back from the rim, where Steinitz probably shouldn't have put it, to a seemingly better square where it's very much hoping to trade itself for the knight on d6. Now, in this position, there are lots of good moves. For example, pawn to a5, going after rook takes b7. But the move that Chigorin played is definitely the move that, as a chess fan, we all want to see. This is a great moment to pause your video and try to figure out what Chigorin played. Chigorin's move is knight takes f7. Brilliant. Boom. This move probably shocked Steinitz, knocking him off of his chair. This wrecks the black king position, dragging the king into the center of the board where it's going to be totally open, and including the follow-up, it's going to open up the e-file, give the knight on f3 a tremendous square on e5, and allow the queen to invade here. All of this ultimately leads to an indefensible attack. King takes f7 here. Of course, this is basically forced because not only have you taken a pawn with the knight and wrecked the king's position, you've also trapped the rook here. And pawn to e6 check. You, of course, need to see this follow-up when you're sacrificing the knight. You have a pawn royal fork here, which is very, very satisfying. And, of course, queen takes e6 just allows knight g5 check. You follow up the pawn royal fork with a knight royal fork, and you win the game on the spot. So after e6 check, black is compelled to capture with king takes e6. Here, knight to e5. Our sacrifice of the knight and the e-pawn has allowed the knight to occupy this beautiful square. The queen is under attack and must move, and she goes back to c8, and rook to e1. The sacrifice of the e5 pawn also allowed this rook to occupy the open e-file. Now, it's hard to calculate your way through and to be certain that this attack is winning here, but in trying to assess an attack like this, I would say that if you have an open file pointing to a king that is dragged into the middle of the board like this king is right here, your attack has really good chances of succeeding. Concretely, white here is threatening knight takes c6 or knight g6 check, and the discovered attack will pick up the knight on e7 that is hanging out behind the king, which is why Steinitz in this position tries king to f6, getting off of the very dangerous e-file. Now, queen to h5, threatening queen into f7 check, which is nearly checkmate, and threatening, for example, after rook f8, knight g4 check, which is checkmate. So after queen h5, here we see pawn to g6, which cuts off the queen's invasion here with queen f7, and it stops knight g4, or it doesn't stop it, but it does create an escape square, king back to g7. In this position, white looks like the attack might be petering out for white, but we must continue calculating the forcing moves. Bishop takes e7, capturing a knight with check. Now, in this position, if knight takes on e7, then we have queen h4 check, knight g4 check is also good. We're just looking to force the king to move away from the defense of the knight. There's no good place to move the king because f7 is covered, and you're, of course, not wanting to step into the e-file with all those discovered checks that will win the material back and continue the attack. So pawn g5, And in this position, knight g4 check, king to f7, continuing to defend the knight. Here, white can win with rook takes e7, which is the best move according to the computer. White is down a rook, but after king takes queen takes g5 check, the king is too exposed, and white is actually mating in 7 at most, according to Stockfish. For example, if king d7, knight f6 check, you don't want to go to the e file, but if you go here to d6, then there's just going to be queen to e5 checkmate. Also, if you go to c7, white here has queen to e5, king d8, and this is forcing mate after the queen blocks and you capture. So there are a lot of lines that ultimately lead to checkmate. I'm not going to present all of the lines and all the ways that black can drag things out a little bit, but the attack is very quickly decisive, and these lines are good illustrations of that. So after bishop takes e7, because of knight takes queen h4 check, Steinitz tries king takes e7, which steps onto the poisoned e file and allows knight takes g6, double check, and on the next move, Chigorin captures the rook. Now, capturing the rook isn't such a big deal, but the problem is that after the capture of the rook, the attack continues. Now, Steinitz would like to capture back on h8, but then rook to e5 is very good. Also pawn g4, there are a lot of ways to continue the attack here. The king is just too exposed, and the heavy pieces for white are too strong. This move is very nice because it's attacking the knight here that is a critical defender. And if, for example, the knight moves, then white has queen g5 check, and this is very effective, queen check. You don't want to go here because of this, but after king g6, you have rook check, and you just pull the rook back. Queen g5 mate, queen h4 mate. This is over. So backing up, after knight takes h8, because queen takes rook e5 is just too much with the heavy pieces hunting down the black king, Steinitz tries bishop takes d4. So he leaves the knight hanging here. He's got it trapped. So he's like, all right, let me just try to mobilize my minor pieces to defend, to hold off Chigorin's attacking pieces. I'll try to get that knight in a moment. I'm actually doing great on material, so if I can just survive, then things would be great. The problem is everything is coming in for white. He includes the one piece that was not contributing to the attack, with rook to b3, intending rook to f3, queen d7, rook f3 does come, and rook takes h8. Yes, the knight on h8 has fallen, but we must always calculate one move further, pawn to g4, and the pin knight is just falling, and this attack is breaking through. This is basically where Steinitz could have resigned, but he's the kind of player who does not like to resign. He likes to resist for as long as possible. He plays rook g8. Now, you can just capture this knight, but black will be able to hide a little bit, and that will drag things out. So a precise move from Chigorin, queen to h6 check. The knight, of course, cannot capture because it is pinned to the king here on f6. And in this position, if the king falls back here, then you don't want to capture because of queen takes, and this would be one way that you could actually lose because the pawn is pinned and cannot capture. But after king f7, you would just capture on h7. You have a skewer here of the king and the queen on d7. If rook g7, then you can capture because after queen takes, there is the queen on h7 going in over here, and it's just everything has fallen apart, and it's mate in a few more moves. So after queen h6, what actually happens in the game is rook g6 and a nice finishing move from Chigorin. He plays rook takes f5 check, and here Steinitz resigned because after queen takes f5, yes, you cannot capture here, but you can play queen to f8 check, and then you capture the queen on f5, and black has no pieces left basically in the position and is mated in just a few more moves. A beautiful game from Chigorin. I really hope that you enjoyed this game. Perhaps you, like me, are inspired by Chigorin's play and really kind of wish that the final game 23 had gone just a little bit better, and he had not blundered mate in that game. If nothing else, it would have been wonderful to see the final 24th game with everything on the line and the match tied 9-9. Chigorin was a truly inspiring player, and one day, hopefully, we will again see an Evans Gambit in the World Championship. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the 1800s and even before that, then click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen.